Now, I'm not completely sure if there is a single person who's been watching my videos since I first started making them 5 years ago. But if you are one of those people, if such a person exists, then they would know that I am terrible at finishing the things that I start, the projects that I start. However, it just so happens that I just finished the biggest project of my life so far, which is my PhD. I am now a doctor. And so I figure this is a good time in my life to try to work on that aspect of myself and ride that momentum and try to finish something else that I started, which are these videos, which I think have turned out really well, and I've had a lot of fun, and I think that it deserves a proper send-off. So here I am back at it to make the final video of this series, which is going to be a wrap-up in which we remove that naive labor theory of value and replace it with what Marx thought would be the full thing, and talk about the observations that he's making there, and also just wrap up the series as a whole. So let's get into that. So the transformation problem as a problem is referred to as a problem in a lot of different ways. It was a problem before Marx approached it. It's also referred to a transformation problem because it's supposedly a problem with Marx's theory. It's referred to as a problem in a variety of ways, but it's a problem first and foremost, I think, in the way that I'm about to describe it. And we've already noted this, actually. I noted it at the end of the rate of profit video. Which is that we have these two assumptions that we've been making for most of these videos that are actually incompatible with each other. There's a logical and dialectical contradiction between them. And the two assumptions are the following. One, we've been operating for all of these videos under the assumption of a naive labor theory of value. And naive labor theory of value, by the way, the word naive there is my own terminology that I've just used to make things simpler and make it clear that I'm going to remove this first word eventually when I get to the video that we're on right now. But the naive labor theory of value, the labor theory of value that we've been operating under, assumes that when supply and demand are in equilibrium, then there's a direct proportionality between price and value. In other words, when supply and demand are in equilibrium, when the price isn't changing due to supply and demand, then the price of then money becomes a unit of time. $1 is 0.6 hours or something like that. Prices don't explicitly encode labor content because they can fluctuate according to supply and demand, but they encode the labor content in this way, that if supply and demand are in equilibrium, then price becomes a unit of time, a measure of time, labor time. And so it's interesting because tied up in this naive labor theory of value is supply-demand equilibrium. And that's the other thing that we've been assuming throughout this series, kind of on and off, directly and indirectly, implicitly and explicitly. Various times, for various different reasons, we've assumed a steady and perpetual supply-demand equilibrium. And we've been doing this whenever we're concerned about, like, steady-state behavior of a capitalist system. And in some sense, we're doing this because we want to understand capitalism at its foundations, but another reason that we're doing this is because the political economists of Marx's time were also doing this. They were interested in like, the conditions of a capitalism that had been allowed to settle down, that had been allowed to kind of settle into a specific kind of like long-term ideal kind of pattern at the end of a long, maybe more rocky process. They're interested in that kind of a capitalism because they believe that it would be utopian, and that's a claim that Marx is trying to contest. That's not the only reason, though, that we're interested in this kind of steady state of a capitalist system. We're going to talk a lot about what it means to have a perpetual supply-demand equilibrium in the next few minutes. But nonetheless, that is something that we've assumed indirectly and directly many times throughout these videos. So what's the problem then? What's the issue between these two assumptions? Well, let's say that we have a steady and perpetual supply-demand equilibrium. And let's say that we also have a naive labor theory of value. Let's say that we have both at once. Well, what we don't have is that different industries have the same compositions of capital. We're not assuming that at all. Different industries are going to still work differently in a world like this. You're never going to reach a point where all industries have the same composition of capital. That doesn't make sense. Some steel making requires a lot of like heavy machinery and heavy industry, whereas a lot of farming does not. So my example here is to compare a 19th century steelmaking factory with a cotton plantation. Making steel requires, a factory. It requires a lot of heavy machinery and raw materials and stuff, and relatively few laborers operating that stuff. So you have to buy a lot of extra means of production, per hour of labor power, right? Whereas if you compare that to like cotton farming, in kind of its simplest way, cotton farming doesn't really require any means of production at all. Cotton farming, all you need is labor. All you need is people. The only other thing you need is like the cotton plant to plant and farm it, but like you get that from harvesting the cotton in the first place. So literally, it practically requires no capital investment. So the cotton farming, you know, in this example, in the way that I'm describing it, has a composition of capital that's practically zero. You don't really need anything to have a laborer do their thing. It's very, very labor intensive. And so, you know, what's that mean for a labor theory of value? So, you know, if you look at our evil equation, pi is equal to E over k plus 1, well, the rate of exploitation E is a socially defined variable. It's a variable that is defined globally. It's the same for all capitalists. So this does not change from industry to industry. But every industry is going to have a different one of these Ks. And whichever one has the lowest K is going to have the highest profit rate. Whichever industry is the most labor intensive is going to have the highest profit rate. It's going to be more profitable than the other industries. And that's really the thing that's incompatible with a perpetual supply-demand equilibrium. Because if a capitalist sees that some other capitalist in some other industry is making higher profits than him, is having a higher profit rate than him, they're going to move their capital over to that industry. If profits are truly dictated by whichever, you know, by how labor-intensive your industry is, then all of the capitalists are just going to dogpile the most labor-intensive industry, and they're immediately going to disrupt that supply-demand equilibrium. So it's not exactly direct that a naive labor theory of value is contradictory with a steady and perpetual supply-demand equilibrium. It's more that the fact that a steady and perpetual supply-demand equilibrium requires an equilibrium rate of profit, which is not something that you get with a labor theory of value, because with the labor theory of value, you get more value when you use more labor. And so different industries are going to have different profit rates. And so that's the way in which these things are incompatible. You simply can't have it. You can't have both at once. Or if you do have, or maybe I should put it like this, if you do have both of them at once, which is what Adam Smith believed would be like kind of the initial condition for a capitalist system. He thought that things started out this way, but then he believed that over time, as capitalism settled into their kind of steady state, and profit rates began to equalize, then the price signal would diverge from the labor theory of value. And so Adam Smith, who was one of the major, fathers of the labor theory of value, actually didn't believe that the labor theory of value would apply in a capitalist society for this reason. He thought it would initially apply, but then as capitalism develops, that prices would diverge from their values over time. And this process by which prices diverge from their values on an individual commodity level is the sense in which this is not just a logical contradiction, but a dialectical contradiction. This tension between these two requirements, the tension between these two things, is going to have an effect on the development of a system in which these two things are initial conditions. If you have both of these things at once, that necessitates a certain development that will happen based on that contradiction over time. And it also is a dialectical contradiction in like the theoretical discourse. This propelled a lot of the theory. This was very perplexing to the political economists of Marx's time. Ricardo especially was very determined to show that there had to nonetheless, in this equilibrium state, be some kind of that prices at this point had to reflect difficulty in some sense. That planes had to cost more than pencils because planes, required more inputs, more raw materials inputs, more means of production inputs, more labor inputs, etc. That prices nonetheless would have to reflect the real requirements of production at this point. He struggled a lot with this, and that's why Marx turns to Ricardo so much, is because Marx is really trying to fix what Ricardo was trying to do. And so that is the problem. And I want to make it clear that this is a problem way before Marx approaches it. This was a problem since Adam Smith. This is something that people are very aware of by the time Marx is approaching it. And it only became Marx's problem after he purported to have a solution to it, or rather, Engels purported to have a solution to it, because Engels kind of advertised that Marx had a solution to this problem before putting out Volume 3. And so people were very eager to look at that, and then they did, and they found a small issue with it, and that created a lot of other that created the controversy that people see as the transformation problem today. So we have the problem, that is this contradiction between these two properties of a certain ideal capitalist system, and then we have Marx's problem, which is the issue with his solution to this problem. And so let's go ahead and start to get into both of those. So the thing I want to talk about first is this idea of an equilibrium rate of profit. The idea of a steady state economy in which all capitalists have the same profit rates. This is a very interesting and special situation that's worth thinking about very closely. What this really means, to have an equilibrium rate of profit, is to have a situation in which any single dollar invested in any industry is going to earn the exact same amount of profit as any other dollar in any other industry. If you invest in some industry, you're going to make the same profits from that investment as anybody else. In other words, it's almost like a sort of socialism among capitalists, because the capitalists they're all getting their fair share of the profit. I invest $5 and I get $7. You invest $5 and you get $7. Everybody gets the same amount, right? It's kind of an equitable situation for the capitalists. That's going to be pretty important to think about as we go. Now, the idea of an equilibrium rate of profit is today actually pretty controversial on its own. And so I need to address that before we start to just assume that we have one. The political economists of Marx's day assumed that over time, capitalist society, through class struggle and competition, would gradually approach such a state. You can't have a situation with perpetual supply-demand equilibrium, unless you have an equilibrium rate of profit. And so they believed that over time there would be an approach within any capitalist system towards equilibrium profit rates for the capitalists. And there is, I've been told, some empirical precedent for that claim. I don't know how to look at data. I'm just a mathematician. My head is in the clouds. I don't know how to look at data. But I've been told that there is some empirical precedent to the claim that an undisturbed capitalist society will generally approach equilibrium profit rates. Now, and it's right here that you start to see a lot of the controversy emerge, because such a process in reality, even if there is this gradual pull towards equilibrium profit rates, such a process will never in reality actually complete. There's always going to be disturbances. There's never going to be a full ability for equilibrium to be approached in this way. Just because there's a pull doesn't mean that pull will actually finish doing the pulling. It's too messy of a system. And so a lot of people argue that even though there is this approach towards equilibrium profit rates, it's not worth considering because it'll never complete. You'll never actually get equilibrium profit rates. But I don't think that this is a very good argument, because there is a constant, if there is a constant pull of profit rates towards each other, then being pulled towards each other means that there's a central point that they are approaching, and that point is clearly playing a role in the dynamics of capitalism. That equilibrium profit rate, even if it's never actually achieved, is always there, is always kind of exerting influence on the capitalist system. It's an attractor for the dynamics of capital at that point, as Ian Wright would say. There are others that would disagree, like Farjun and Mackover in Laws of Chaos, a probabilistic approach to political economy, argue that this entire thinking about equilibrium is wrong. That you can't think about a capitalist society in equilibrium this way, because prices, even in equilibrium, are fundamentally random, in the sense that somebody can go to market and demand anything for any price, or demand any price for their commodity. And as long as things are like that, prices are random variables. And so the only reasonable way to think about a capitalist system in equilibrium is to think about it as like a statistical equilibrium, in which like the distributions have settled to something that's constant, but are still random. Profit rates still vary, but the expectation and variance and likelihood of getting a particular profit rate, that's the thing that settles down and stops changing. And that's the only thing that's worth thinking about according to them. And if you're taking averages and trying to like approximate more like deterministic dynamics out of that, then you're doing something wrong, and you're doing something that's anti-scientific. There's people that disagree with this entire thing that the political economists are going to be dealing with. And so there's a lot of controversy here. And you're probably getting as overwhelmed as I am just thinking about it right now. But let's back up. So this idea of like an equilibrium economy with an equilibrium rate of profit is controversial. It's way more controversial today than it used to be, than it was in Marx's day. And there's a lot going on here. But I think that there's a lot we can observe if we just accept these premises, as Marx did. And on the note of accepting these premises, I want to say something there. So Marx, as we've seen, is accepting the premises of these early political economists in order to form a critique. And so it might be the case that there are people that say something along the line, that don't like the idea of an equilibrium profit rate, and say something along the lines of, well, these are the political economist premises. They're not Marx's premises. Marx is only accepting these premises in order to form a critique. It's not necessarily exactly what Marx believed himself. Well, and I think that the danger there is that's overlooking that Marx is never accepting. He's accepting these economists' premises to form a critique, but he never accepts a premise that he believes is strictly wrong. He's only going to accept the premises if he agrees with them. What he's interested in doing is taking the things that he agrees with and then saying, you need to think about this harder. You need to go forwards with this. You need to think this out more. He's not. I don't think that there's ever a place in which he accepts one of these economists' premises that is in which he thinks that it's ridiculous. He's only accepting things if he agrees with them. Marx does subscribe to this idea that there is going to be a gradual approach towards an equilibrium rate of profit that diverges things from a labor theory of value. And the danger to abandoning this whole discussion is that this does serve an essential purpose to Marx's conception about how capitalism is operating and what is socially necessary within capitalism. What is socially necessary within capitalism is that nobody has any idea what the hell is going on, and we're going to talk about this a lot. That the way that this discussion fits into Marx's conception of capitalism, Marx's kind of understanding of political economy, is that he thinks that this process is simultaneously the process by which capitalists can delude themselves and also delude the workers from understanding the labor theory of value, because understanding it would be dangerous. And I think that observation that this kind of a process happening is going to serve to scramble information and confuse everybody is extremely important, extremely valuable today, extremely applicable, and has big general implications for how our world works. So before getting into an equilibrium rate of profit, before thinking about that, let's just think about the real world for a minute. There's a real world principle that I think we need to observe that is really what motivates Marx to proposing the solution to the transformation problem that he does. And the observation goes like this. It involves noting something that I haven't noted yet, but it's definitely time to note, which is that, we've been talking about surplus value since the third video, but we've been talking about surplus since the first video, since the video on historical materialism. I mentioned that surplus product, the production of just more than what's necessary to do what you need to do, that's a characteristic of agricultural society in general. The existence of a surplus product is how we got here. It's the story of historical materialism. It's the driving force. So let's forget about surplus value for a second and just think about the surplus product. Just think about the real use values that are being produced that are extra, the surplus extra stuff. And note the obvious fact that a class in power will generally be enjoying the lion's share of this surplus. And so how do they get access to that stuff? So the capitalist class, the class in power, is going to have access to this extra stuff. They're the ones that get that extra. And how do they get their extra? Well, they get it by paying for it with their profits. And so it's in this sense that it absolutely has to be the case. It is ridiculous to think otherwise in the real world that the profits of the capitalist class correspond to this surplus product. And surplus value is merely the socially necessary labor time required to make the surplus product. It is merely the value form of the surplus product. That is I think, the fundamental hypothesis, because there has to be a deep connection between the surplus product of society and the profits of society. There has to, therefore, be a deep connection between the total surplus value produced by society and the total profits of the capitalist class. And we're going to come back to this at the end. We're going to think a lot harder in a little bit about why this deep connection exists when we're thinking about money and capital and the mode of production as a whole and kind of wrapping up our thoughts. We'll come back to this because this is a really important thing to think hard about. But for now, I'm just going to leave it at that there has to be a deep connection. And this deep connection between the surplus value and the total profits is, on a basic level, going to have to persist however prices end up developing and however they might end up diverging from their values over time. However the price system ends up developing from a labor theory of value, this basic fact has to remain, that there has to be a deep connection between the surplus value and the total profits. This is the key kind of intuitive insight that I think is central to Marx's solution, Marx's proposed solution to the transformation problem. And what we are going to see, even when we get to the controversy, is that he's correct. There is a very, very, very close connection between total surplus value and total profit. It's not going to be perfect, but I want to say right now that this principle is true, and we're going to see that it's true. It's not perfect within our models, the models that we've built, and I'm going to talk about why it might not be perfect at the end of the video. But it is true, and it is a principle that you can apply to society right now, and it only makes sense to do so. And as long as that's the case, like we said, assuming that there is a deep connection between the total surplus product and the total profits of the capitalist class, that can only be accomplished if there is a deep connection between the values of things and their prices. Even if it's not determining, even if the individual values of things don't determine their prices, there has to continue to be a very deep connection between values and prices in a world like that. And so that's really the intuition. That's really Marx's intuition here, is that the surplus product and the profits coincide, and so because of that, the surplus value and the profits have to somehow still coincide, even after values have diverged from prices due to some kind of approach towards equilibrium profit rates. So with that said, let's get into Marx's thinking here. So what Marx is going to do, just like he usually does, is he's going to accept the various premises of the various political economists. So the political economists believed in a gradual approach to this equilibrium. And Marx is going to tell us his version of that story. He's going to begin with a society in which initially we do have a naive labor theory of value. Initially, in this initial state of the capitalist society, prices are directly proportional to labor values. And as we noted, initially this means that labor-intensive industries are going to be more profitable than capital-intensive industries. Now, we've already begun the story about what happens in a world like this. We said already that capitalists, the most natural thing they could do is start to just reallocate their capital into the more profitable industries. I should mention, though, that this does assume that capital is fully mobile and capitalists are fully willing to do this. That's not always going to be the case. And we'll talk about what they're going to do when they can't just reallocate their capital like this in a little bit. I'm actually going to add quite a bit onto Marx's assessment of what goes on here and what else I think is involved in this process. But I think what Marx is observing in this process is very important to kind of highlight on its own first. By doing this, we already mentioned that this is going to create differences between supply and demand. This is going to disrupt any supply-demand equilibrium that one had before. You're going to have artificial scarcity in the less profitable industries, and that's going to boost prices above their values. And you're also going to have an artificial oversupply in the more profitable industries, and that's going to lower prices below their values. And so what this is going to do is it's going to, through, fluctuations due to supply and demand from the values, it's going to bring us towards a point in which the rate of profit is equalized. However, by approaching this point, we are now, as we said, disrupting that supply-demand equilibrium. So how do we reconcile these two things? Well, this is where Marx actually makes quite a Keynesian assessment of things. But he pitches it in a very dialectical and kind of interesting way. A dialectical inversion occurs at this point. Society itself begins to adjust its own consumption habits to this new situation, making this deviation from the normal into the new normal. What was supply-demand disequilibrium is now going to become the new equilibrium. The demand once created the supply, and now it's going to flip around. The supply creates the demand, just like the Keynesians say. The Keynesians make a big fuss of the fact that you can create demand through supply. If you have less, if consumption goods become cheaper, then people are going to learn to consume more of those goods. We've already talked about that a little bit. And if a certain means of production becomes more expensive, then the capitalists are going to learn how to use less of them, and so forth. The society itself, the social interpretation of demand is going to change. It's going to conform to what capital requires for this process of equalization. And I think that's a very insightful thing to note, and very much a thing that goes on. Demand creates supply sometimes, but then other times after that, supply creates demand, and then it's a dialectical process back and forth. It's not simply one. The causation is not simply one way or the other. The causation flips around back and forth, and that is an essential part of this process that Marx is describing. That eventually brings us to a point in which the rate of profit is equalized, and we have supply-demand equilibrium because society has changed what it demands. It's conformed its demand around these new prices. Another insightful thing that we're observing here is that capital tends to produce artificial scarcity and artificial oversupply. And that's something that I think people are very familiar with. Well, here we're encountering it for the first time. We're seeing why that happens, or we're seeing at least one reason why that happens. And the importance of this particular reason why this happens, and I think why Marx is very focused on it, is that it is not the result of people making decisions. This is something that happens entirely behind the backs of the capitalists. It's a subconscious process that the capitalists facilitate but do not consciously produce. This is a process by which the system acts on people rather than the other way around. Remember that we said that within Marx's conception of capitalism, one of the main overall goals of his is to show that in many ways, if not in most ways, the system is the subject acting on people as the object. Well, we're seeing an example of that here. This is the system acting on us rather than the other way around. And I'm going to return to that here in just a minute. But for now, the overall result of this process is that we have now a transformation of values into prices of production. Commodities are no longer in this situation going to sell at their values. They are going to sell at some new price that Marx calls the price of production. We have basically three numbers associated with each commodity. We have their values, their labor content, and then we also have their prices of production, which are their equilibrium prices, their prices when you have equilibrium profit rates and supply-demand equilibrium. And then you finally have market prices, which we had before. It's just that before, market prices would basically orbit around their values according to supply and demand. Well, now, prices are going to fluctuate not around their values, but around prices of production. So prices of production are now kind of the central pivot point that market prices orbit around according to supply and demand. I think the reason that I think it's important to highlight this particular reason why profit rates equalize, as opposed to others, which I'm going to get into here in a minute, that I think are important for their own reasons, is what I said before. That this is the process of capital acting on us rather than the other way around. This is a process that happens behind the backs of the capitalists. This happens whether the capitalists realize they're doing it or not. And so I think that that's really important to acknowledge first and foremost before getting into anything else. And the other two, I think, central insights within this description of what's happening is one, that Keynesian observation that supply creates demand, except we should see it a little more dialectically than that. It's not just that supply creates demand, it's also that demand creates supply. It goes both ways, depending on the time of day, you could say it like that. The effect of supply and demand on prices and on production is a feedback loop. It's a back and forth process by which society is conditioned by what's available and also decides what is going to be available. It's back and forth. And then the final insight is that capital just periodically will create systemic scarcity in certain commodities and systemic oversupply of other commodities. It's going to be incentivized to do this, and we should expect to see it do this. So that's three different, I think, important insights to gain from observing this equalization process. However, there are more conscious factors in play here besides just this unconscious process towards equalization. The transformation of values into prices is not simply this. It's an ongoing process that is constantly going on, and there's a lot more going on to it than just this. There's a lot more going on in this process of the transformation of values into prices than simply capitalists reallocating their capital. And there are reasons why it's happening that we can observe a lot more directly, and I think it's just as important to observe those. So let's get into that. So Marx describes the systemic reasons in which you get an equilibrium rate of profit. However, I think that what's the much bigger driver of the process of the transformation, not necessarily the transformation into an equilibrium profit rate, but this transformation process, this process by which value is covered up and replaced with price. I think the much bigger driver here is the struggle among the capitalists themselves. And there's a lot of interesting things to note here. So basically Marx is describing this process of the transformation as occurring due to competition, just simple competition between the capitalists. However, I think it's very clear to anybody with eyes that what's going on here, that there's a lot more going on than just this. There's a lot of actual real conflict, like struggle happening within the capitalist class itself. It's an intra-class struggle. It's a class struggle between the capitalists. The capitalists fight each other over their fair share of the surplus. The capitalists in the steelmaking industry that are making less profits than the ones in the farming industries, they're getting mad and they're making plays. They're fighting the other capitalists in the other industries. We have this big intra-class struggle. And we know that class struggle, not the capitalist class struggle, but struggle between actual classes, is the motor of history. Class struggle is the thing that is going to create over time either socialism for all or common ruin for all, right? It's going to produce one of those outcomes. And so, just as the interclass struggle between the workers and the capitalists is going to eventually produce one of these outcomes, I think it's equally reasonable to say that the intra-class struggle here going on with capitalists, between the capitalists themselves, is going to produce something similar. It's either going to produce some kind of, quote-unquote socialism for the capitalist class, socialism among the exploiters, or it's going to create common ruin among the capitalists. And to the extent that it produces the former, that it produces some kind of socialism for the capitalist class, well, remember what we said about the equilibrium rate of profit. To have that kind of a situation is to have something very similar to socialism for the capitalists. It's to create a world for the capitalists in which everybody is treated fair. Everybody gets an equal amount of profit per their investment. And so I don't think that I need to tell anybody how applicable to our current reality, socialism for the capitalist class is. There's a lot of critics of our society that go out and say that we have something like this, with our current reality of bailouts and golden parachutes and so forth. Now, these things that they're pointing at certainly aren't, an equilibrium rate of profit. But I think it does serve to point to there being some very real observations being made here that are obvious in some way. There is something going on here. This is having an effect on the development of capitalism. And so what I like about this, thing I'm pitching that isn't exactly anything that Marx said, this is my own conception of what's going on, is that one, it incorporates not just one aspect of what's going on in circulation, but all aspects. There's a lot more going on within the capitalists in their decision making than simply reallocating and shifting around their capital. And so to just say struggle incorporates all of that phenomena that we observe every day, and we'll talk about that phenomena in a moment. That's one thing. Another thing is I think it's very elegant, struggle. You can simply say, rather than talk about supply and demand fluctuations or anything like that, you can simply say struggle within the capitalists is going to produce some kind of equality among the capitalists over time. And then the third insight is that, the socialism that you get out of this process is only one extreme endpoint of the situation. The other endpoint, like I said, is common ruin. But we're going to see, after getting into the concrete details of what this conflict looks like, that the common ruin, the super extreme of that alternative endpoint is also an equilibrium rate of profit. So in order to understand why that's going to be, let's finally address the question of what does the struggle between the capitalists actually look like? What are we observing here, really? Well, let's say that I'm in the steelmaking industry. Let's say that I'm a capitalist, I'm making steel, and I'm annoyed that I'm making a lower profit rate than most other capitalists, like let's say the ones in agriculture. And let's say that there's a bit of a sunk cost thing going on in my head here. I'm not just going to shift my capital over there, but what I am going to do is I'm going to exercise what power I have. I have some power over the world. I produce steel, especially if I'm one of the bigger steel manufacturers, especially if I've eaten up most of the other steel manufacturers. I have some economic say in the world. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out there and I'm simply going to charge more than I should. I'm simply going to say, nah, this is actually, I need more profit, so I'm going to charge more. I want more profit. I'm going to charge more. I can do that. I'm allowed to do that. It's a free market. And even if the steelmaking firm doesn't have a monopoly in the sense that they can actually do that, well, there's still options. They can go out there and they can essentially organize a union of steelmakers. This is exactly what things like OPEC are. OPEC is essentially a union of the oil producers. It's a union of the oil-producing countries that can basically exercise economic power in order to demand prices that they deem fair. This is the kind of, and that's exactly the same kind of struggle that happens between the workers and the capitalists. It's essentially the same principle as that of a union. It's exercising monopoly control over a product. The same kinds of conflict are going to be happening among the capitalist quote-unquote producers. Obviously the capitalists are not producing, they're exploiting people to get the production, but they are organizing and they are engaging in conflict with each other over prices in the same ways, in similar ways to ways that we've been talking about the conflict between the worker and the capitalist over their wages. It's the same kind of conflict. And so I think this is also an interesting kind of thing to observe that's happening. And to the extent that you can use it as an argument for some kind of equilibrium rate of profit being approached over time, to simply say that it is due to struggle among the capitalists over prices, I think it's kind of elegant and fun. And I also think that something added on to Marx's argument is sort of necessary. Because while Marx's argument is definitely extremely insightful and has a lot of interesting aspects to be thought about, there's a lot of insight to be gained from thinking about what Marx is describing, and to some extent what Marx is describing has to be happening and part of this transformation process. But I'm not at all convinced that those on their own, even theoretically, are going to produce an equilibrium profit rate over time. I have not seen any sufficient theory to justify that to me, and I'm not convinced at all of it. And so that's why I started to think along these lines, I think, over time. And I'll be honest, I kind of forgot what Marx's argument actually was and sort of convinced myself that this was his argument for a while. But it isn't his argument, but I do think that it adds a lot onto it. I think that this is a really cool supplement to his argument. It doesn't make the same points that he's making about capital acting on us. This is very much action being taken by people. It's people affecting the system rather than the other way around. But to some extent, you have to admit that both of those things are happening simultaneously. And since this conception of things is sort of observing capitalism as a developing process from the other direction, I think it highlights different principles that are important to note, equally important to note. So let's start to get into those. So what we have so far is that capitalists are going to have a struggle within their own class over prices. They're all going to demand their fair share, and they're going to fight over it. And I think the main thing that this conception of things highlights is that this fight occurs in circulation and not in production. This fight over prices has nothing to do with the value produced in the factory. And so to illustrate that, I have another example. The example that I have is a story that most people know about that takes place in the year 2015. Everybody knows about Martin Shkreli, the pharma bro, when he went out and decided suddenly for no reason to take this drug, I think Daraprim is what it's called, and raise its price by 5,000% just overnight. He just went out there and he said, "Now this is now $750 per pill. It used to be $13.50. I think I deserve more. It's $750. That has nothing to do with a labor theory of value. That has nothing to do with production. This happened overnight. This cannot have anything to do with the surplus value produced. The total surplus value produced by society has not changed. That is the pharmaceutical industry deciding that it has enough power in the world to demand more of the surplus. By demanding a higher price for that product, they are demanding a higher amount of the surplus product. Forget surplus value. But think about this in real terms. If they charge more, then they can take more of the surplus. So that is a fight happening in which the pharmaceutical industry is mounting an offensive and trying to take as much of the surplus as they can. That's the kind of class struggle that's going on here. It's not class struggle, it's struggle within the capitalist class. It's the capitalists fighting over the surplus. And in fighting over the surplus, they are screwing over everybody else, obviously. They don't have to care. But that's what's going on. It's the pharmaceutical industry making a play of dominance against all other industries. So basically, what you should be thinking about in our capitalist society, our actual existing capitalist society, is that within production, value is produced. Surplus value is produced. Things are produced. Think about the factory. In the factory, the stuff is produced. Then in circulation, in the sphere of the market, the capitalists are going to fight each other and charge everything that they can, as much as they can, in terms of prices. Within the sphere of circulation, capitalists fight each other over distribution of the surplus product that's produced. That is the very simple, but nonetheless, I think, very important principle that I think you see when you look at things this way, that explains a lot of phenomena that we view in our world each day. And so this argument for the equalization of the rate of profit, you can see that, one, it's never going to finish. It obviously, this is not, we're talking about like extreme ideal endpoints of a process in which the process is much, much more important than the result, which is the title of this slide here. And we'll talk about what's important about the process here in a moment. But let's kind of finish up our observations about the endpoints and what could happen. Now, you might have been hearing what I said about like monopoly formation specifically as one of the main components of this struggle that goes on, and you might be thinking, well, that sounds a lot more like common ruin, and you're right. So I think it's time to really kind of put all this together, and kind of put together a picture of what we should expect our world to look like at any given moment. And so let me draw a picture here. So the picture I sort of have in my head to illustrate this looks like the following. So let's say that we have an equilibrium profit rate. Let's make it green. So I'll just make a green dot here to represent the equilibrium rate of profit. And I'll make all the other actual rates of profit for each industry or capitalist or whatever, I'll make them white. And so basically you have like a couple of things going on at once. So on the one hand, you have the industries that are still competitive on the one hand, and also the industries that, let's say, are like unionizing, you know, in the way that like OPEC does. Because I think that if you're doing that, then those industries, even though they're exerting monopoly control, they're really engaged in a process of demanding shares of the surplus that they deem fair. So those are the two processes that I think lead towards like an equalization of the rate of profit. Those industries, I think you'll find kind of bunched around the eventual, like, you know, extreme endpoint, that equilibrium rate of profit, like in that sense. You'll eventually, those will be like bunched around, and they'll be kind of, you'll be seeing like a pull of those industries towards the equilibrium rate of profit. They'll all be kind of moving towards it. They'll probably never get there, and they'll probably occasionally move away, and there will be all sorts of complication, but there will be a bunch of industries that are kind of clustering around some clear like attractor that is the equilibrium rate of profit. And so, and those kind of, you know, we can put them in like a radius. We can give them like a bubble that they're in. And so outside of that bubble is the common ruin industries. These are the capitalists that are creating enough monopoly control over themselves that they can sort of demand higher profit rates and simply keep them. You know, and this is not just capitalists that have like become, you know, gotten a lot of monopoly through like market share and centralization, but also capitalists that have like natural monopolies. So the capitalists, when I've been talking about monopoly, I've been mostly talking about like artificial monopolies, as Marx would put it. But there's also natural monopolies. There's monopolies over like specific resources, like oil reserves and so forth. And those, I mentioned that you get constant super profits over that. So that's also included here. There's a bunch of capitalists that are just going to enjoy kind of profit rates outside, that are far outside of the equilibrium profit rate, that are simply not being attracted at all, that are like outliers within this process, and that is its own process of certain ones freezing and staying outside of that bubble. However, this process of monopoly, strangely enough, also creates a drift towards this green dot, and the way to understand that is like let's look at like this guy. So this guy is enjoying a higher rate of profit than normal, but it's still smaller than this guy's rate of profit, meaning that this guy's ratio of like surplus value to operating costs is a smaller number than this guy's. And so let's say that this guy, you know, monopoly happens and this guy gets to devour this guy. This guy absorbs that guy's operation. If that happens, well, then what's going to be the profit rate of that new firm that is the join of these two firms? Then if that happens, then what's the new profit rate going to be of this kind of centralized capital? It's going to be something in between. The ratio of surplus to necessary costs here at this point is going to be lower than it was before. In other words, the capitalists can't simply like eat each other without kind of equalizing the rate of profit. They're going to end up with a lower rate of profit when they do that. To think about it a different way, maybe, you know, all of these different capitalists, they're all enjoying kind of an unusually large slice of the cake, right? If the cake is the total surplus value, then everybody gets a slice of the cake, and these guys just get bigger slices. If this capitalist eats this capitalist, then, you know, the total size of the cake has not changed. And so, you know, and so you're not really going to be able to enjoy that, like, extra large slice anymore, because that would require a larger cake. You can't just maintain the same, you can't just eat this guy and make the overall profit rate of society bigger. That's what would be required. You can't just eat this guy and get a higher profit rate. And so your actual profit rate is going to have to kind of approach what the other guys' are. You're actually going to have to sort of lose some of that privilege. You know, it's going to be even bigger if this capitalist here eats this capitalist here, right? That's going to bring him, like, you know, over here. So basically, as these capitalists devour each other, they sort of lose their monopoly privilege in terms of their profit rates, because at the end of the day, and we're going to talk more about this in a bit, the overall profit rate of society, S over C plus V, like the Marxist profit rate that we've been talking about, the total surplus value divided by the total necessary kind of operating cost, that's the only, you know, that's what the equilibrium rate of profit is going to be, more or less. And so, you know, if there's only a single capitalist left, if you take things to that kind of an extreme, and you only have one capitalist left, well, they're going to have that profit rate. They can't have any other. And so the process of monopoly actually also creates an approach of all of these dots towards the green dot. As these white dots devour each other, they actually end up also simultaneously approaching the equilibrium profit rate. And so all of the different processes we've talked about, like the collective action on the part of different capitalist producers, the centralization and monopoly formation, the competition and reallocation of capital, all of these different processes actually create a drift of the profit rates of the different capitalists towards the same equilibrium rate of profit. It all constitutes a drift towards this green dot right here. And so I think that speaks to the importance of considering an equilibrium rate of profit. I think that, you can see that either way, regardless of how the process decides to finish, even if it never finishes, there's still clearly something to consider here. There's still clearly something to think about regarding an equilibrium rate of profit. So that's sort of how I see things, and that's sort of how I see all of this stuff kind of coming together. And so that's kind of how I see things. To me, the transformation process is first and foremost a process, and the endpoint of that process is only a means to the understanding of that process itself. By supposing that we have an equilibrium rate of profit, to suppose that we've somehow emerged on the other side of this process, even if that's probably never going to happen, almost certainly never going to happen, we can still derive insight about the process itself from doing that, and that's exactly what our goal is going to be. And so now let's finally transition to, I think, the most important part of this video, which is to talk about what the actual socially necessary purpose of this process is. And to understand that, we just need to note that as soon as this process begins, as soon as you start your capitalist system off that has a naive labor theory of value in place and perfect supply-demand equilibrium, and things start to develop and be disrupted, and the capitalists start to fight, and competition starts to equalize profit rates, and people change their consumption habits, and as all of this goes on, as soon as it even starts, this is all happening in circulation, and it's all happening through the distorted lens of money prices, and this confuses everything, because now it is very hard to tell where prices actually come from. This fighting that the capitalists are doing with each other over the surplus, they're doing it through charging different money prices. And so now it's very hard to say, it's very hard to look at money prices and be like, what actually is this? How is this reflective of the value? It's, in some sense, at a foundational level it is, but it's also not, because people are going out there and just deciding randomly to charge 5,000% more for something. And in that exact sense, the process is complete as soon as it starts. The process itself is sufficient on its own to fulfill the socially necessary role that Marx believes that the transformation fulfills, which is that it scrambles information and it makes everybody confused and it mystifies the money form. That's the point, and that's what it does. You don't need the process to finish for the role to be fulfilled. So I want to get into that before talking about any of the controversy, because this point is in play. This point is valid regardless of any of the controversy. And we're going to see that, by observing these end states, which we'll do in a little bit, we're actually going to see that what those perfect states correspond to, those states in which you have an equilibrium rate of profit, they correspond to a situation in which money does its job of mystifying everything maximally good. We're going to see, amazingly enough, that is a state in which money blinds people the most. It provides a maximum amount of confusion to everybody, and it mystifies everything kind of perfectly at that state, which I think confirms that this process itself is doing its job, because at its most extreme, it does the job that it's supposed to do perfectly. But before we get into that, let's think more about this socially necessary role and why it's actually necessary. So again, it's an ongoing, never-ending process in our reality. But the process itself serves the purpose that Marx believed was essential to capitalism, which is to allow the capitalist class to intentionally blind themselves to the origin of their profits, while simultaneously blinding the workers themselves of their own exploitation. That is the essential principle at work here. That is the thing that I would like people to walk away from this video knowing about. I don't care if they know about any of the controversies. I care if they know about this general principle, because this is the thing that's essential to understand about Marxist theory. And because the transformation problem is so controversial, people tend to actually just completely miss this, I think. A lot of people walk away from Marx, even after reading all 3 volumes, not understanding this idea, this general principle, which is true. There's nothing controversial about what I'm saying here. After the transformation from value into price, whether it be in an equilibrium economy or not, whether it be in a perfectly fair capitalist society or one in which they're still fighting, it doesn't matter. The origin of the capitalist profits are hidden from society by this process. That's the principle of the transformation. That is why we care about the transformation, and that is why you should care about the transformation. The transformation I almost don't even see as like a transformation into equilibrium prices. It's just an ongoing thing that is happening. And this is a socially necessary thing. This is, again, it's one of those things where it's like capitalism would not be capitalism if it didn't have this feature. It's an essential feature because from the perspective of capitalism, if you're somebody that wants to keep this thing moving, the labor theory of value is dangerous. Think about what would happen if workers understood it. Let's think about what would happen here. Suppose that the workers understood perfectly, the conversion from value into price. They understood exactly what their labor would be worth in dollar value. So let's say that I give my employer 8 hours of work a day. If I'm a worker, let's suppose that I do that, and that they gave me wages that I know are only worth 5 hours. That is not going to work. That is not going to be a viable society. I will understand immediately that I'm being ripped off. So the transformation of value into prices, it serves the essential purpose of hiding this information from the worker, while also allowing the capitalist to blind themselves to the role that they play in the system. It's not just a bourgeois neuroses, like I mentioned earlier. It is that, but it's also a way to pacify the working population. It makes everybody, it alienates everybody, and that's the side effect of doing those two essential purposes of making the worker pacified and making the bourgeoisie happy, or feel like they are good people or whatever the hell. The social relations have to be mystified in order to keep a stable mode of production. This is a social necessity, and money serves that function. The dazzling money form, as Marx calls it, it blinds us all to the actual social relations between people. Prices appear after this process, because of this process, I should say, prices appear to be beamed down from the heavens. They confront us, they dominate us. The fetish is complete by this process. We don't at that point, I make a thing and its price confronts me. I don't know what I can't figure out how to associate what I did in the process of making that thing anymore to the price of it. That's what happens. So, don't take my word for it. Let's see a couple Marx quotes about this. So, the most direct thing I could find is on page 168 of volume 3, I guess that in the Penguin edition, where he says, "The transformation of values into different prices of production serves to obscure the basis for determining value itself." Again, that's the purpose it serves. And then a much more interesting quote a little further down, he says, "The individual capitalist, or all the capitalists in each individual sphere of production, whose outlook is limited, rightly believes that his profit is not derived solely from the labor employed by him, or his line of production. This is quite true as far as his average profit is concerned. To what extent this profit is due to the aggregate exploitation of labor on the part of total social capital, i.e. by all of his capitalist colleagues, this interrelation is a complete mystery to the individual capitalist. All the more so since no bourgeois theorists, no political economists have so far revealed it." So there's Marx being a little cocky there. But yeah, I mean, again, it's interesting because, the capitalist can now go out there and say, no, my profit rate doesn't have anything to do with exploitation. It doesn't have anything to do with me exploiting my individual laborers. He can say that, and they're right when they say that. They can correctly observe that now. There's no better mask than a mask that is like this, that is valid. They can validly claim that their individual exploitation of their individual workers has nothing to do with their profit rates. They can say that now, and they can be correct. That is a really powerful way to hypnotize yourself, and that's the purpose that the transformation serves. And the reason that they're correct, and this is important, is because at this point, after the transformation process begins, capitalists are no longer getting surplus value that is in line with the actual surplus value that they are producing for society. It is now as if capitalists are producing surplus value for society and then getting an equal share of it. At this point, it can only be said at that point that it is the aggregate capitalist class that is exploiting the aggregate worker. It is a relation between capital and labor that is social at that point, and is not at all connected to the individual relation between the capitalist and the laborer. Exploitation is not an individual relation between a worker and a capitalist, a particular worker and a particular capitalist. Exploitation is an exploitative relationship between the working class and the capitalist class as a whole. And despite leaving in some sense a labor theory of value through this process of the transformation, it is still that remains true to the extent that the total surplus value is still kind of determinant of and deeply related to the total profits. And we are going to see that that is true. Despite the controversy, that is still going to be true, even in the models that create the controversy in the first place. There's other models in which there's no controversy. But in any model, even when there is controversy, it's only like a 10% difference. And even that 10% difference, there are people who argue, that I'll talk about later in the video, that 10% difference is not due to there being something else going on that creates profit besides surplus value, but rather that we are calculating surplus value incorrectly or overlooking something, like not accounting for a certain amount of value here or there. There's some kind of problem with the labor accounting, but it is still actually labor that accounts for that 10% difference. But we should be honest here, and we should admit to ourselves that we are, at this point, leaving behind, to some extent, the labor theory of value. We're not leaving it behind in the same way that the political economists before and after Marx left it behind. But to continue to develop the labor theory of value at this point is to discuss the way that things change from that initial condition of a labor theory of value, and to track and make sure that there is at all points still a determining connection between total value and total surplus value and total profits, and to that extent a very deep connection between between individual prices and individual values. The task of somebody that's still trying to, I guess, do the labor theory of value at this point is to show that you can only get so far away from it if you still want to maintain this exploitative relationship. Again, the labor theory of value, we're about to really get into the controversy, and you can say that the labor theory of value at this point has been abandoned by respectable quote-unquote economists because of this controversy, because of the controversies that we're about to get into. Abandoned not in the sense that I just said that we were about to abandon it, but completely abandoned. Abandoned as in just discarded as if it never mattered, and as if it has nothing to do with prices today. But are we supposed to just overlook that it was in the interests of capitalism to abandon the labor theory of value? Are we supposed to believe that they abandoned the labor theory of value purely out of some kind of reverence for the truth? Are we supposed to just overlook that it was convenient that they do this, that it was imperative that they do this? Are we supposed to overlook that? I don't see anybody talking about that, and it really raises an eyebrow in my head. Why was the labor theory of value really abandoned? Was it abandoned because of these technical issues, or was it abandoned because it was dangerous? I don't know. I'm not going to claim I know the answer to that one way or the other, or that there even is one, but it's something that I wanted to ask. I'm just asking questions here, man. I don't know. So now, with those incredibly important points made, let's actually move on to the resolution to this process. Let's start to evaluate what happens, assuming that Marx and the political economists, let's accept those premises that this process eventually ends and we actually get an equilibrium rate of profit. Let's start to think about what we have now. Because by doing that, we'll start to veer into the problems and some of the controversies. I'm not going to get into them in any great detail, but I am going to bring them into the models we've constructed and evaluate the question I'm really interested in asking about the controversies is, how much do they really mess up the things that we've said? That's obviously, I think, the thing that I have to do, assuming I have to do anything. So again, so let's suppose that the capitalist class achieves its intra-class socialism. Let's say we get this socialism within the capitalist class, i.e. an equilibrium profit rate. So what does this new world look like? Well, we can summarize what we know already. What we know already is one, that the naive labor theory of value that we've been discussing no longer is in operation. It is no longer a thing. However, we've also said many times now that the essential thing that we are keeping the whole time, not just at the end of the process, but during the process, we have that the total surplus value produced by society is always directly proportional to and determinant of the total profits of the capitalist class. So the capitalists are no longer going to be individually taking home with them profits that are in accordance with surplus values that they actually oversaw the creation of within their enterprise. Some of them are gonna walk home with less surplus value than they oversaw the production of, and some of them are gonna walk home with more value. But the total surplus value produced by society is nonetheless going to still be total profits. And you can think of that as almost like a conservation law, like total energy is conserved. Total surplus value is conserved in the transformation from value into price, as Marx is conceiving of it. So this means that despite prices no longer being proportional to values, the money profit rate experienced by the capitalists would nonetheless, as a whole, I should have said experienced by the capitalists as a whole, the total money profit rate is still going to be given by the same rate of profit that we've been looking at. It's still going to be given by this overall equation for pi. This is still the overall profit rate of society, even after the transformation has finished, according to Marx. And as a general approximate principle, I think we're going to see that even within the controversial models, that's not a bad thing to think. It's generally going to be the case. It's not going to exactly be the case, otherwise there would be no controversy. But we're going to see that even within the models we've constructed where things are controversial, this isn't too far off, generally, especially when there's not a crisis going on. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So we have, let's say that we have initially like the values. I'm now getting into kind of Marx's own kind of like sketches of various math that he did in this part. So we have values. What we have are values, and we're trying to come up with what the prices of commodities are in this new settled world. We are assuming that the profit rate, the rate of profit for society, is still given by the value rate of profit that we've been working on since the third video, which is S over C plus V, this pi number. Then in that case, if we're given a commodity, a specific commodity, which requires D dollars worth of means of production and labor power to produce, then what that means, remember, is that the money profit from that commodity is always just going to be pi times D. This is the amount of profit that you get. That's what it means to have an equilibrium rate of profit. This means then that the total price of the commodity has to be the amount that you had to spend in order to do the process of making it, plus the profit that you get in order that you get that profit. So in other words, the commodity's price that you post it for at the market is going to be what you paid for it plus what you deserve in profit for having done that process of making it, D plus pi times D, or 1 plus pi times D. And we're going to call that P. And this is, as we said, what Marx calls the price of production for the commodity. I mentioned earlier that a commodity which requires D dollars worth of means of production and labor power, I'm going to call that the cost price. That's what Marx calls it. The cost price is not the value or the price of production. It's just the dollar value of the investment required to make the commodity. And basically what Marx says is you can approximate the price of production of a commodity given the values by using the values as an approximation of the cost price. Instead of taking the actual dollar price, the dollar cost price, and multiplying that by pi to get the price of production, you can take the value version of the cost price and multiply that by 1 plus pi to get something that isn't the price of production, but is close. And Marx basically says this works as a decent approximation, and he works with that. And he mentions that if you do this to all of the commodities, then you can do it again after that. You can use those new prices as cost prices to approximate the price of production better. And then you can kind of repeat this process over and over and over again in order to gradually obtain the prices of production for every commodity. And this approximation method is correct, assuming that the equilibrium rate of profit is actually the rate of profit given by the value rate of profit that's right here. Assuming that pi is actually the equilibrium rate of profit, which Marx is assuming by these conservation laws, this is an iterative process that does produce the prices of production from the values, as Marx claims. And so that's kind of Marx's algorithm. That's Marx's transformation. That's the iterative algorithm that produces the prices of production according to him. And I want to emphasize that this iterative process is not where the controversy comes from, because assuming that this actually is the equilibrium rate of profit, this pi number here, this will work, and this will produce the prices of production from the values. So in other words, if there is any controversy, which there is, it has to do with the assumption of these conservation laws, of this conservation law. There's really only one. I don't know why I said laws. The controversy could only come from one place, and that is the assumption that this is the overall rate of profit, that this is the equilibrium rate of profit. So let's think about that. Now, unfortunately, before getting into that, I have to admit that I lied. When I said that the only place that controversy could come from is that this pie isn't actually equal to the overall money rate of profit that capitalists are experiencing, that is the only place the controversy can come from in the sense of bourgeois political economists pointing at Marxists and saying that Marxism is bunk. That is the only place that the controversy can come from that perspective. However, I have to also mention that there are groups of Marxists that disagree that this iterative algorithm is at all what Marx was actually proposing in Volume 3 when he was doing this. I'm going to talk about the iterative algorithm as if it was, but before I do that, I have to at least acknowledge that there are Marxists that think that Marx wasn't proposing an approximation method that converges to the prices of production from the values, and that it was an ongoing process in a different sense. He says something about ongoing processes. I can't remember the exact quote, but there are people that make valid points about the kind of dual system models that have been created since Marx wrote Volume 3, or died writing Volume 3. And I'm going to talk a little bit more generally later about all of these toy models that have been constructed since he died, and what I think of them kind of broadly. But the name that you need to know, I think, if you want to look into the alternatives to an iterative process like the one that I'm going to be talking about is Andrew Kleinman. Kleinman makes some extremely important criticisms about those dual system models that have been created, and points out very rightly that they are indeed toy models, and he proposes an alternative. Now, I haven't looked into Kleinman's model closely. It seems a little wonky at first glance, but the thing is, to the extent that it's valid, it is still also a toy model, and is still also going to have its own set of problems and assumptions and simplifications that are not entirely true in reality. And so again, like in a little bit, I'm going to talk about what I think about all of these models, and talk about how I don't really think that any of these models can possibly be like the correct one. But we'll get into that a little later. Nonetheless, the criticisms of Marxism from the outside, the actual real controversy of the transformation problem, that bourgeois economists point to, does assume that particular toy model that Andrew Kleinman is critiquing. And so I'll talk more about models here on the next slide, but that, we're going to proceed with the iterative algorithm interpretation, because that's where the real transformation problem criticism comes from. So I love my title to this slide, The Supposed Problem with the Solution to the So-Called Problem, because the transformation problem is a lot of fun and we're having a good time here. Now, at this point, I think it's unavoidable that I start to bring in my perhaps somewhat unique perspective on this stuff. And, the perspective that I've sort of developed for myself is, based on my own implicit biases as a mathematician that's been trained by a logician. And I would really have to probably carefully go through all 3 volumes of Capital again to confirm the suspicions that I've sort of developed through not only reading Capital, but reading, like, the various modeling controversies, regarding this and other things that have been happening after Capital. I would have to probably go through all of it again in order to really confirm my hunches. But I'm going to state my hunches anyway, because all I can do is be genuine, right? And so my view of things is that what Marx is doing in the 3 volumes of Capital is not the same thing as what is typically viewed today as the acceptable way to operate. The acceptable way to do science is not what Marx is doing in the 3 volumes of Capital. Because the acceptable way to do science, especially economics, I think, the acceptable way to do theory now is to carefully define toy models and that are founded on, like, very explicit operational sets of assumptions. You write down a set of assumptions and you build a toy model, and to the extent that those assumptions are true in reality, you can obtain results in that toy model that give you insights into the reality that we have. That's how math is done, that's how economics is done, that's how science is done. It's just how things are done now in academia. But it's not really what Marx is doing in the volumes of Capital, and it's not really what we've been doing in these videos either. What Marx, to me, seems to be doing in the volumes of Capital is not so much building a toy model based on assumptions about how capitalism is working, but rather he's kind of directly engaging in sort of a dialogue with reality, like a dialectic with reality. He's not building any particular model. He's making observations about his world, sometimes backed up by data and sometimes backed up by just his experiences. And he uses those observations to construct theoretical principles, and then he goes as far as he can with that. He goes as far as he can with that theory until he runs into a roadblock, and then he goes back into reality, motivated by those theoretical conclusions. Motivated in the sense that now he knows exactly what to look for, and he goes out and he brings back more assumptions based on his observations of reality. And that allows him to work more in abstraction and develop more theory, and then keep going until he reaches the same kind of a roadblock, and then he goes back into reality, and then he kind of keeps going like this, back and forth. And so he's engaging in this back and forth. He's not constructing a single theoretical toy model and then staying within those bounds. He's continually reaching out into reality and pulling things back in order to expand some kind of more fluid model. It's not even really a model. I almost look at it as if what he's doing is he's trying to work within the real model, the actual model, the actual model that is the real capitalism that surrounds him. He's not trying to build a toy model. He's trying to work within the actual thing, and he's doing this in a dialectical way. Another thing you could possibly say that Marx is doing, if you don't like the idea of him not building a model, and trying to work within the real model, I'll talk about why I think that is kind of valid towards the end of the video. But you could instead say that he is building up many different models simultaneously that are based on different sets of assumptions, but even in that case, what he's doing is he is constantly reaching out into the real world and expanding those models. He's bringing in new assumptions and making his models more complicated as he goes. But either way, how he's doing things is different than how things are done today. Or at the very least, it's different than, like, let's say what Morishima is doing in the book that I've been using to make these videos. Morishima is making one explicit toy model built on a specific set of assumptions. He removes a few of them later, but for the most part, he is just building a single model of a capitalist system. And at the very least, that is not what Marx is doing. And so it would seem to me that Marx kind of died, and when he died, he was dying right as certain methods of inquiry and operational principles were really starting to kind of ossify and solidify in academia. Like, this acceptable way to do science was sort of just starting to form, I think, as he died. And since then, you have all these people that are looking at what Marx is doing and trying to write academic critiques of it and develop it further, and they're all working within this new paradigm that I don't think completely applied to what Marx was doing. They're trying to create toy models. They're trying to assume that Marx was making a toy model, and then they're making toy models that they say this is what Marx was doing, and everybody's arguing with each other. Nobody can come to any conclusions because there is no perfect way to do this. There is no perfect way, in my opinion, and I'm motivated here by the incompleteness theorem. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but in my opinion, there's no perfect way to take what Marx is doing, take Marx's direct engagement with reality, his dialectical method, and produce a toy model that really captures what he was doing, because what he was doing is fundamentally different. But that's nonetheless what people have done, and you can I'm saying this now because you can only get to the controversies within a toy model. There's multiple toy models that expose these controversies, and that doesn't mean the controversies aren't real. They are. There are real implications here that need to be explored. But nonetheless, you simply cannot talk about the logical issues with what Marx is doing here, without filling in some of the ambiguities that are left with what he's doing because of his method of inquiry. Because of his method of inquiry being more fluid and not necessarily saying all of his assumptions in advance, he brings things in as he notices them. There are ambiguities here. I already mentioned one of them with Kleiman's thing. And his issue with the temporality of some of the assumptions. Those are the kinds of arguments that are breaking out here. Nonetheless, there was a particular model with a particular set of assumptions, or at least a particular flavor of model, that was almost immediately attached to his work after he died. And that's the one in which the transformation problem, the supposed, and that's why I say supposed here, the problem with his solution, that's when it arises. And it's a real problem. I'm not trying to like dismiss it because of this, but I can't talk about my takes on it without mentioning this. So, you know, you have this toy model version of what he was doing, and it's a toy model in the sense that it has things like a fixed number of commodities that's never changing. You know, your capitalist economy is never coming up with new commodities in like the Sraffian model that I guess you call it now. That these Sraffian models have fixed numbers of commodities, they have fixed production methods, they have fixed labor values. These are all things that Marx sort of maybe assumed. They're reasonable to build as models to model what Marx is doing, but they're never really like assumptions that he makes permanently throughout the book. He makes these assumptions sometimes, and then he lifts them again, or he doesn't even say he's lifting them again, but he starts to talk more generally again. He never keeps any of these kinds of like fixed assumptions for very long. He kind of turns things on and off. But nonetheless, if you decide to build a toy model and really fix these assumptions once and for all, then what you end up seeing is that it can be shown that if all capitalists are assumed to profit at the exact same profit rate, in other words, if you have an equilibrium rate of profit, then there's only a single number that equilibrium profit rate can be. That actually follows from like a mathematical theorem called the Perron-Frobenius theorem. If you put together a matrix of all of the like labor costs and materials costs, and also encode some information about like labor costs in the form of wages, then a property of that matrix gives you that there's only one profit rate that could possibly be the equilibrium profit rate. And that's a problem because that equilibrium profit rate that is the only candidate for an equilibrium profit rate is not Marx's value rate of profit. Generally, there's a few special cases in which it is, and those special cases are very interesting and worth considering. But they're not equal to this rate of profit here. This rate of profit within those models cannot be the equilibrium profit rate. And so it cannot actually follow that we have that conservation law that we mentioned. It is not exactly the case that the total surplus value and the total profit are the same thing. And it is not exactly the case that the equilibrium profit rate is Marx's value rate of profit overall for society. It actually turns out that it generally cannot be the case. And so Marx's transformation, this description of capitalist reality, cannot be the full story. There has to be more going on than what we've observed so far. So again, we have toy models, we have reality. What these toy models are pointing out with this issue is that even within the logic that we've been operating under, even without bringing any new considerations into our capitalist system, we have concluded that there has to be something more going on with the total profits of the capitalist class than just the surplus value produced. Or at least with the surplus value produced given the labor accounting framework that we've sort of assumed implicitly up until now. There are people like Ian Wright, who I'll mention a little later, that think that that's been done wrong, that there's been an insufficient level of consideration of all of the different things that require labor, and that's causing the problem. But we'll get to that later in a little bit. Something endogenous to the model, something within the models themselves, that is to say, not like something that hasn't been brought into the model at all, like, sign value or brand name value or something like that. Something that kind of is implicitly there within our model has to be playing a role that we have not considered. And I'm not going to claim to really understand very well what that is. I don't. That is something that I am still a little bit confused about myself. There has to be something. It's not entirely clear to me what. But but that's not to say we won't leave our inspection of this without some ideas about where the problem has to be. We'll see that it has to have something to do with the consumption of the capitalist class and the disparity in compositions of capital between different departments. That has to be the culprit in some way. We'll see at least that much, but I don't really know the details of what's causing the problem beyond that. But there is something missing, and the toy models show that there's something missing. And so that does apply to Marx's stuff here. The fact that these toy models aren't what Marx is doing does not dismiss that the fact that there is something else going on here, and I can't really tell you what it is. So that is the problem with the solution to the problem. The problem with the solution to the problem is that Marx's value rate of profit, Marx's overall value rate of profit for society, is not generally going to be the same, even within these toy models and within this kind of restricted set of assumptions. It is not generally going to be the same as the equilibrium rate of profit. Now, the specific place in which we really did for a prolonged amount of time and with a lot of importance assumed a persistent equilibrium rate of profit is in the reproduction schema model, that Desmos app that I made. That modeling assumed constant supply-demand equilibrium, and we know now that constant supply-demand equilibrium requires an equilibrium rate of profit, and that was one of the assumptions that I made without mentioning it in that video because I thought it would be confusing. But I did make that assumption. I made that assumption by omission. We were assuming an equilibrium rate of profit because that's the only way to maintain supply-demand equilibrium. And so what we can do now, even though we have this problem, you know, that the equilibrium rate of profit is, if we assume that we have one, is not generally equal to Marx's value rate of profit. We do nonetheless know what it is. Within that model that I built, you can calculate what the equilibrium rate of profit has to be. And so I would like to jump back into that Desmos app now and show you that, and then also bring it into reality, essentially, in the following way. There's a big kind of unfinished thread with the model, which is that the model that we built has capitalists reinvesting their surplus value. Well, we know now that that's not what capitalists are looking at the end of the day. At the end of the day, capitalists are looking at their money profits. And so we can actually redesign the model from the ground up, or I have. I'm not going to do it for you. I don't want anybody to see that. But you can redesign the model from the ground up on the assumption that the capitalists are reinvesting their money rather than their surplus value after this transformation was done. And I actually have an alternative version of the Desmos model that you can just turn on and look at. So let's jump back into that Desmos model now to finish the model, to really bring it into reality fully and see what there is to see, and also to kind of consider this problem with the transformation problem, and to just kind of see what there is to see, because I think it'll illustrate quite a bit. So here we are. We're back in the Desmos app. We can illustrate kind of what I was saying in the last slide immediately. If you scroll down to this technical parameters that are fixed by prior assumptions tab and open it up, I think it's closed by default, but if you click this and open it up, then you also have these global parameter sliders. So the things that you can adjust, the things that are adjustable within this model, are the rate of exploitation, the rate of reinvestment, and the compositions of capital for the departments. And like I said on that previous slide, if you do fix those numbers, then there is only a single number that the equilibrium rate of profit can be, that the capitalists are experiencing in money terms. And if you scroll down into this technical parameters fixed by prior assumptions tab and you scroll down, you will find it. It's right here. And you can see that it's defined in terms of the V's and the C's for the departments. If you fix the compositions of the capital for the departments, and you assume that the capitalists are experiencing equilibrium profit rates at all times for all their commodities and in constant supply-demand equilibrium, then this number, pi sub g, 0.33 as it is right now, this is the only thing that the rate of profit can be that the capitalists experience in money terms. It has to be this. And it's fixed, as you can see. So let's think about what the implications of that are. If you scroll way down to the rates of profit that we've already mentioned, these p numbers here, there's all sorts of rates of profit. We've got the rate of profit for the departments in value terms, which are constant. We turned those on before. I'm not going to turn those on just yet. But you know But the value rate of profit, Marx's, E over k plus 1, that's this P of t right here. If you turn this on, this is the rate of profit that we have been talking about. This is pi as we've been talking about it, this black line. And you can see that it is changing, with the growth paths. And the reason for that, recall, is that the composition of capital is changing as society, wildly swings back and forth between more labor-intensive departments and more capital-intensive departments. That will affect the value rate of profit. And you can see now, I didn't mention this because I thought it would be confusing, but you can see that if capitalists were experiencing this as the rate of profit, then you would not have supply-demand equilibrium, because as soon as the rate of profit starts to fall in certain departments, that's going to change their behavior. So I didn't mention it, but if this was the rate of profit that capitalists would be experiencing, we wouldn't be on these curves. It can't be the case that this is the rate of profit. But you can also see that the rate of profit is more or less constant as long as we're on a balanced growth path. And you can turn on this piece of B here to see what the rate of profit would be on a balanced growth path. So for now, actually, just to make things simpler, let's go ahead and just focus on the balanced growth path. So I'm going to put us on a balanced growth path by changing y sub 2I to be b sub g1. Just to put ourselves on a balanced growth path so that we have a constant value rate of profit to keep things simple at first. And so what you can turn on here is you can turn on, so we have the value rate of profit. This is Marx's rate of profit. And if I turn on the equilibrium rate of profit that the capitalists are actually experiencing, even on this balanced growth path, here it is. And you can see that they are a little bit different. They are different. This right here, this is the problem. This is the transformation problem as like Marx's problem. The fact that this orange line here, this rate of equalized money rate of profit that the capitalist is experiencing is not the same thing as Marx's rate of profit as we have been describing it. This difference right here, this little bit of difference, this is the transformation problem. These two lines will be equal to each other in exactly two cases. Case number one is if the compositions of capital for the departments are the same. You can see that as I bring K2 down towards K1, you can see that they are closing in on each other. They get closer and closer to each other as K1 approaches K2. So the closer the departments are in compositions of capital, the closer the equilibrium rate of profit is to the actual value rate of profit that Marx is concerned with. I can't actually set, if you try to set these equal, you'll break the graph, so don't do it. But if they were equal, then these two would be the same. There is another case that I think is significantly more interesting than the compositions of capital being the same, because of course that'll never be the case. And the following thing will never be the case either. It's actually the case that the equilibrium rate of profit equals the value rate of profit if the capitalists are reinvesting everything. If they don't, if they consume none of their surplus and reinvest all of it, then in that case it actually does turn out to be the case that these are the same. In fact, you can simulate that by taking A, the rate of reinvestment, and making it equal to 1. You can see that as the rate of reinvestment approaches 1, you get closer and closer, and when A is equal to 1, in other words, when the capitalists are reinvesting all of their surplus and not consuming any of it, then there is no transformation problem at that point. So to the extent that, so in other words, the less the capitalists are consuming, the closer these things are going to be, these two numbers are going to be to each other, which is very interesting. And then another interesting thing that I'll talk more about later is that if you bring it down to 0, you might think that, you know, if as A goes to 1, these things converge to each other. So it's obviously going to be the case that if I'm really close to 0, in other words, if the capitalists are consuming most of their product, then it's going to be really, really off, right? Well, look, even if it's literally 0, it doesn't get that much further away. So you can't get that far away from it, and you're generally pretty close. I'll talk more about the closeness in a little bit. Speaking of things being 0, I'm coming in a little late to add this, but I thought it was worth noting. I added a little thing that you can turn on down here where the rates of profit are. This function u of t. I'm running out of letters, so I'm using u. But this is the rate of exploitation. You can simply turn this on and off, and it's set to 1 by default, so it's kind of far above. It's like way up here. But it makes sense that it's farther above because remember back in the third video, we showed that the rate of exploitation is generally always going to be bigger than the rate of profit. And that applies to the equilibrium rate of profit too. And that's important because it shows, because remember, the fact that the rate of exploitation is always bigger than the rate of profit means that if exploitation is 0, then profit also has to be 0. And so since the equilibrium rate of profit is also bounded below the rate of exploitation, it follows that exploitation is still required to have a positive rate of profit. And that's known as the fundamental Marxian theorem, according to the guy that kind of developed this model. They called it the fundamental Marxian theorem, the fact that exploitation, despite these two rates of profit not necessarily being the same, is still required you have to have exploitation in order to have both. So like I said, there is a deep connection between the total surplus value produced and the total profit produced, even if the total profit produced is not exactly the same as the total surplus value produced. And so you can see that by taking the exploitation, you can see that as we bring this down, the two rates of profit both fall simultaneously. They actually get closer to each other. So I guess I lied when I said there were only 2 ways to make these equal. When exploitation is 0, they will also be equal because they will both be 0. You can see at this point that the rates of profit are both the same because there is no profit. There is no profit without exploitation, even with the transformation problem. So I thought that was worth noting. And you can also go ahead and, if I turn on these two guys, then you kind of see the full story. The value rate of profit, like we said, is sort of bounded inside of the rectangle given by the rates of profit for the departments. The equilibrium rate of profit is no different. And that's important because it means that we still have a falling rate of profit, given the assumptions that we've made. You can see that as I increase either of these k's, all of these rates of profit are going to fall simultaneously. You can see rate of profit do be falling. There is still a technologically induced rate of profit even with the transformation problem. Either way that you take it. If I bring this down, that brings down both curves. You can see that both the equilibrium rate of profit and the value rate of profit are falling at the same time when I increase either composition of capital for either department. There is still a falling rate of profit. And you can see that very clearly by just messing around with the compositions of capital and sticking to a balanced growth path. It's a little more complicated when you get off of a balanced growth path, but you can see that discussion really isn't affected much by the transformation problem as a problem. In other words, even though the equilibrium rate of profit isn't actually S over C plus V, as Marx was claiming it was, it still falls for the same reasons that S over C plus V falls. It still depends on the same variables and falls and rises in the same directions. It behaves the same, in other words. A falling rate of profit translates to both of these curves, the black one and the orange one. And so you don't have to worry about any, you don't have to doubt yourself. You don't have to doubt much of what we said in the fourth video. There's still controversies, don't get me wrong, but what we've shown here is that the controversies have to do not with the transformation problem, but really with the claim that the compositions of capital are rising. That's where the controversies are. It has nothing to do, as far as I can tell from this, with the transformation problem. Regarding the incentive structures, capitalists pursuing super profits individually by reducing labor costs is what produces the falling rate of profit in the first place. And if you think about it, those incentive structures aren't really changed either. If a capitalist reduces their labor costs, they are still earning super profits for the same reasons. And so they're going to try to do that. And so that argument is also unaffected. So the entire argument that I gave still applies in this new transformed world that we're in. And as long as we're on the subject of confirming observations made in previous videos, turning to the law of accumulation and those predictions about the growing reserve army, you might be thinking about those other two models that we made to kind of demonstrate that and thinking to yourself, well, we need to try to check the transformation problem there too, right? And the answer is no, because those were single department models. Like, we were kind of just thinking about the total output of society as a big bundle, as a big amount of value. And so it's kind of implicitly the case that you only have one department. As long as you only have one department, you have kind of vacuously that case I mentioned where the equilibrium rate of profit and the value rate of profit have to be the same because the compositions of capital of the departments are all the same. That is the case because there's only one department. So if there's only one department, then all the compositions of capital of all the departments have to be the same because there's only one of them. And so the equilibrium rate of profit and the value rate of profit are the same in those models. And so there's nothing to check. Those models are still valid even after you've thought about the transformation problem because the rate of profit, there is no difference between these two rates of profit in those models. So that argument is unaffected as well. So it looks a lot like I said earlier that the value rate of profit is pretty close to the equilibrium rate of profit. And you can see, that it is. But this distance on its own, just looking at it, isn't really saying much because both rates of profit are small. So, what we really need to ask is how accurate is the value rate of profit, Marx's rate of profit, as an approximation of the equilibrium rate of profit? For example, suppose I had Marx's value rate of profit. I could potentially use that rate of profit to kind of predict how much profit is going to be earned from the production of a commodity given its cost. You could use Marx's rate of profit as an approximation of the equilibrium rate of profit to do that. And you could ask yourself, how accurate is that going to be? And to find out the answer to that question, I have down here these T sub B functions, these T functions, T sub B and T sub P. If you turn on T sub B for now, it's going to show up in the negatives because the value rate of profit is underneath the equilibrium rate of profit. But if you scroll down, you find it down here, and it's at about negative 0.04. So what this t function is it's the relative difference between the value rate of profit, Marx's rate of profit, and the equilibrium rate of profit. And so the fact that it's negative 0.04 means that the value rate of profit is smaller. It's negative. The fact that it's underneath makes it negative, and it's smaller. But as an approximation, it's 96% accurate. In other words, what this is saying is that there's only a 4% difference between the equilibrium rate of profit and Marx's rate of profit. Marx's rate of profit is not equal to the equilibrium rate of profit, but it is extremely accurate. It's 96% accurate. It's only 4% off is what this is really saying. And so Marx's value rate of profit is actually 96% accurate in its ability to predict actual profit in reality in this world. In this Desmos app, in this particular configuration, you can use Marx's rate of profit to essentially approximate the real world up to 96% accuracy. Now, when I say that, I need to be careful. What I just said is that you can use Marx's rate of profit to approximate profit up to 96% accuracy. That is not the same thing as saying you can use it to approximate prices. You can still use it to approximate prices in the exact way that Marx claimed. Just take the cost price in value terms and multiply it by the value rate of profit. But the error in that approximation will be worse because the cost price that you're taking is not the same as the actual cost price. The value you're taking is an approximation of the cost price. So it's doubly an approximation, and so it's not going to be 96% accurate. It's going to be a little bit less accurate. Not a whole lot. It'll probably be at least like 85% accurate. So that's kind of cool. But it should be said that I'm almost positive. I haven't really cranked out the math carefully, but I've looked at it closely enough that I'm pretty sure, like 90% sure, that his iterative algorithm is going to fail. If you keep trying to do it over and over again, like some people say he suggested, if you try to do this iterative method of feeding that back in as a set of cost prices and going from there, then you're going to eventually spiral off either to infinity or zero, unless that rate of profit that you're using is exactly the equilibrium rate of profit. And so his iterative algorithm fails. His transformation overall fails, but it does. The first couple of steps of it should nonetheless be a decent approximation of prices. But you can't get like prices arbitrarily close to the real thing. You can only approximate them to a certain extent and no further. So that's worth noting. But nonetheless, these things are very close to each other, generally. Despite these numbers being different, they tend to be very similar, especially if you're on a balanced growth path, and especially if you're not experiencing a crisis. So to see that next, let's go up here and get off of the balanced growth path finally. So let's go ahead and set this back to something like, I don't know, 0.674. So that eventually things go haywire. And so now we are no longer on a balanced growth path. Now we're going to have disproportionalities, and let's see how that affects how off the Marx's value rate of profit is from the actual equilibrium rate of profit. The last function that I want to turn on is this t sub p function. This is basically the relative difference between the balanced growth path value rate of profit and the equilibrium rate of profit. This is the real deal. This is the relative difference between the actual value rate of profit and the equilibrium rate of profit. This is kind of only there to prove a point. I'm going to turn it off. And you can see that, of course, as long as we're approximating balanced growth, there's not much difference between, the actual, value rate of profit and the balanced growth path rate of profit. But as we leave balanced growth eventually, you can see we're starting to spiral off balanced growth right around here. And you can see that the value rate of profit falls below the balanced growth path rate of profit, and that is going to correspond to a dip in how accurate Marx's value rate of profit is as an approximation of the actual equilibrium profit rate. You can see that it drops a little bit and gets a little bit worse. You can see after that, the rate of profit gets a little bit above the golden age rate of profit, and initially it's actually, like right here, it's actually kind of perfect. Like for the split second, they're identical. But then, at that point, you have actually like a better approximation for a little while, except that the Marx's rate of profit is now a little bit over what it's supposed to be, and then things swing the other way, and then you kind of get way off. And by the time you're having a crisis, by the time the crisis really hits, you're at around 35%, meaning that like you're getting at that point at the time of like a disproportionality crisis, Marx's value rate of profit is actually not at all a good approximation of actual profits. It's not at all going to actually give you something that is an accurate measure of the rate of profit that the capitalists are experiencing. So that is probably an important moral of the story, is that when the crisis sets in, Marx's value rate of profit becomes kind of trash at actually measuring the rates of profit that capitalists are experiencing. But I mean, what would be accurate at that point? Everything is going to hell. People are experiencing probably wildly different profit rates in general. So I mean, what would work at that point? It's almost kind of expected, I think. But in times of relative calm, it's actually a pretty good. It's actually pretty good, and you can mess around with the settings a bit. And what I've kind of concluded from messing around with the settings is that you can generally expect that Marx's value rate of profit, the rate of profit that we've been working with since the beginning of the series, basically, is generally within about 90% accuracy of the actual equilibrium rate of profit that you would be experiencing in an equilibrium economy. Now, of course, we are not in an equilibrium economy, but nonetheless, how different could the process approaching this actually be from the real thing? I think that the moral of the story here is that Marx's rate of profit is not the actual overall rate of profit of society as we experience it. But it's a pretty damn good first approximation. If you have like a decent approximation of the rate of profit, then that is pretty close. That is going to be, I think you should expect, unless there's a crisis going on, I think you should expect it to be pretty close to the actual rate of profit that the system is experiencing. I think that is the moral of the story. It's not the same, and to the extent that it's not the same, you have a problem, and you need more theory developed to address that problem. But the thing that I think I see a lot of people doing is abandoning more than they should. This is still a pretty good first approximation. It's amazingly good. Marx's results are amazingly close to reality, even in this model that is supposedly being used to throw out the whole theory. You're throwing out the whole theory because what, you're 10% off? No, this is a really great way to think. This is, if you're looking for a mode of thinking that you can assume is decently accurate, then here's your proof. It's decently accurate. Even in this model that supposedly breaks everything, it's still pretty close. It's not a big, there's not a big difference between the equilibrium rate of profit and Marx's rate of profit. It's not that huge of a deal. And to conclude this proof of mine that it isn't that huge of a deal, that the results that we've gotten up to this point really are, rock solid in terms of like the overall macro-dynamical assumptions that we can make from it, we can do one last thing, which is that we can replace these growth curves with the real growth curves. These growth curves are what you get when you assume that the capitalists are reinvesting a fixed proportion of their surplus value. But now that we've done the transformation, we know that that's different than reinvesting a fixed proportion of your actual money profit. So what do we get when we do that? Well, what you can do, I'm going to turn most of this off. In fact, all of it. So in a world in which capitalists are reinvesting their money, that still corresponds to reinvestment of value. It's just not now it's no longer a fixed proportion of the value. It's kind of something a little more complicated. And the complication is given by these J numbers here, which are also found in the technical parameters that are fixed by prior assumptions tab. Basically what you have is what this J number is given an amount of value in department 1, J1 times that value is going to give you how much money that value is worth. And then J2 is a separate number that is the same thing for the wage goods department. Given a certain amount of value in wage goods, that corresponds to a certain amount of money. There's no longer a direct proportionality that works for both departments, but there is a constant of proportionality for each department that's different. And you can see that the wage goods department actually has a higher coefficient. If you take a certain amount of value in wage goods, that's going to be worth more money than the same amount of value in the capital goods department. And the reason for that is because the wage goods department has a higher composition of capital and therefore a lower profit rate. And so in an equalized world, in a world in which everything is fair for capitalists in both departments, you would have to basically inflate up the price of things in the wage goods department by a little more than they're supposed to be. And so the same amount of value is worth more if it comes out of the wage goods department than if it comes out of the capital goods department. And these J's give you those conversion factors. And you can go in the other way too. Given a certain amount of money in a department, that corresponds to a certain amount of value that comes from just, dividing. And so in a world where capitalists are continually reinvesting a fixed proportion of not their surplus value, but their money profit, that is still going to correspond to some reinvestment of surplus value. It's just not going to be a fixed proportion anymore. It might be changing. I mean, it's not clear what's going to happen to it. But that is the real world. In the real world, or at least in this idealized, equilibrium world, but in this world's version of the real world, capitalists are reinvesting money. They're not reinvesting surplus value. They're blind to the surplus value. They are blinded now. They are only looking at their profits, their money profits. And so, but we still have, because of these J numbers, a way to go from that investment and that output and track the value anyway. What we're interested as Marxists is still tracking the total value outputs of society. We're just in a world now where capitalists themselves are not thinking about that. And so what we can do is I have basically alternate versions of everything. You see I have Y1 and Y2 here. These are the warranted growth paths. I have the almost balanced growth paths like before. And then below that, you see I have this other stuff. These right here are the exact, are the same thing. If I turn these on, these are the growth paths for the value output of the departments over time, just like these are right here. They're the exact same quantities being tracked, but in a system in which capitalists are reinvesting their money profits now, their fixed proportion of their money profits rather than a fixed proportion of their surplus value. So the question we should ask is what do these growth paths end up looking like when capitalists are reinvesting their money rather than their surplus value? And it looks like this. If you turn on these YPs, you get this. You can see it doesn't look a whole lot different, does it? It looks different, but it's the same dynamics. You get the exact same dynamics back. Let me turn off the other ones. And indeed, it is the same. Again, these are value. This is the exact same. These are the exact same curves as before. It's just the kind of underlying logic is different. The capitalists are now looking at their money profits and reinvesting their money profits. But it turns out that when you work in a world where they're doing that, like the real world, you get the exact same dynamic phenomena that we've already noted, and that's why I was able to simplify matters in the previous videos by not mentioning this at all, because I knew that when I got here, it would be observed that nothing is really different at all. In a world where capitalists are completely blinded to value and not even like earning rates of return that would be consistent with like a labor theory of value, you still get growth paths in value terms that have the same insane dynamics that we've noted and the same real consequences that we've noted already. This is still a crisis right here. It's still a point where there is no capital goods industry anymore when it gets to this point. That still applies. And so everything I said in those previous videos applies in a world in which capitalists are reinvesting money profits rather than surplus values. And just to kind of prove that to everybody, one thing we can do, I mean, you can change as much as you want, but one thing we can do is, we get this oscillatory case when the composition of capital of the wage goods department is higher than that of the capital goods department, and you should get that divergent case. If these dynamics are truly the same, then you would get that divergent case when you made this bigger than this. And sure enough, if I bring this up a bit and bring this down a bit, you see that I do get exactly that. I get these kind of just straight divergence, just like before. Nothing fundamentally changes when you go into the world in which capitalists are reinvesting their money profits rather than their surplus values. There is one big change, though. There is one big difference. I will say, by the way, that I think that my balanced growth paths for the money case are, I think, broken. I don't really know why they're so high up, but the almost balanced growth paths do work. These look like what they should look like. So I don't know what's up with these, but these work. And then if we kind of go through other functions related to the system, this I never really talked about and don't really care about. And then below that, we have the rate of capital accumulation, G. Now, the rate of capital accumulation and the demand for labor, these two definitions don't need to change at all, and they'll still apply. You can see that they look the same and behave the same as before. But and the demand for labor doesn't, there's nothing more to say about the demand for labor, because the demand for labor can only be really viewed as a function of the accumulated capital in value terms. It doesn't really make sense to talk about it otherwise, because we're measuring real labor demand. But the rate of capital accumulation is a little bit different, because everybody is obsessed in real life with the rate of capital accumulation. Everybody is obsessed with the growth rate of the economy. Oh, the economy is growing by 2% or 3% per annum or whatever, right? Everybody's interested in that. And so there would be a crisis right here. It would be very disruptive to actually have this rate of capital accumulation as the rate of capital accumulation that the capitalists are observing. But that's not what they're observing, is it? They're not looking at the rate of capital accumulation in value terms. They're looking at the rate of capital accumulation in price terms. They're looking at how fast the economy is growing in terms of how much more money is being used, like in the circulation of capital in that process. And if you graph that, then you see something completely different. And I think this is really going to hammer in the dazzling nature of the money form. If you turn on the rate of capital accumulation in price terms, which is down here, G sub P, after you've converted, the capital into money, just you can see these J terms here doing exactly that. What do you get? You get a constant number. And you can see I calculated it. It's not, I didn't write in a constant. I did the calculation to make sure of this. If you look at how fast the economy is growing in price terms, even though all of the value dynamics are the same, if you look at the economy's growth in price terms, if you look at the economy the way that the capitalists are going to blind themselves and look at the economy, they're not going to notice this at all. They don't notice this at all, because they see the economy growing at a steady rate of 0.167, it looks like. It never changes. The price form just completely pulls the tarp down over everything wrong with capitalism. It just blinds everybody. And this is the ultimate example of that. This shows you that very, very clearly. So like another thing we hadn't considered when we were looking at this model originally, when capitalists were reinvesting their surplus value, is if they're looking at the value directly, then they would have changed their behavior if they were looking at this G function as the actual growth rate of the economy. They would notice a problem right here. They would notice that the economy, that there's a slowdown in the accumulation of capital, and they might change their investments up. They might change their behavior. But if they're actually reinvesting according to the money, if they're actually looking at the growth rate of the economy in terms of money, then they're not going to notice this at all. Everything just continues to cruise right by them. They don't notice. And it's also why you really don't have the full story of this model until you have capitalists reinvesting in price terms. Because it's only once they're reinvesting in price terms that you can truly see how they manage to follow these paths until finally ending up on a crisis. They're not going to notice any problems. They're not going to notice problems until it's too late. And the price signal itself guarantees that. If you're measuring the economy in terms of price, then the scrambling that occurs through the transformation, assuming that it finishes, and honestly, probably it doesn't need to finish. Again, all you need is that scrambling effect. This is just we're just looking at long-term behavior that points to kind of what the price signal does at its best. Like the situation that we're looking at, in which you have resolved into perfect kind of socialism for the capitalists. You should think of this as simultaneously the situation in which the price signal does the maximum masking of information. It does its job best. And at its best, what does the price signal do? It fully blinds the capitalists to the actual real workings of the economy. That's what it does, and that's what we're seeing here. So this is why you should simply find it funny and try not to laugh when somebody tells you something along the lines of, like, when someone offers you a book written by like one of these financiers that was like presiding over the banks during the 2008 financial crisis and stuff, and being like, they have to know a lot about this. They have to be smart, right? They're right there in the middle of it. They know what's going on, right? No, they don't. They have no clue what's going on. In fact, these people at the top, these financiers, they probably have the least idea what's going on. They are the ones you should trust the least about any of this. They are the most blinded to this shit. The people that focus on the money, to the extent that you focus on the money, you are blinding yourself. That's the conclusion here. I wanted to come back in and make that very clear as I was editing this. It's really quite amazing, honestly. The very last thing that I think I haven't talked about in this Desmos app that I have is not very dramatic or important. It's just something I added for myself. If you're curious, the capitalists are reinvesting money, and so they're not going to be reinvesting like their surplus value in sort of like a stable way anymore. So here is the rate of reinvestment. Basically, like the rate of reinvestment A is now interpreted to be the rate of money reinvestment. So there's a new kind of function, which is the rate of reinvestment in terms of value. They're reinvesting a constant amount of their money, but that now means that they're reinvesting a varying amount of their surplus value. And if you want to know how much of their surplus value they're reinvesting per period, that's what this function A sub p gives you. This is how much of their this is getting a little insane, so let me turn some of this off. If you're curious about what's really different, this is what's different, is that A, as if you're thinking about like the rate of reinvestment of surplus value, that is now variable. It's constant, while you're on a stable growth path, but it starts to mix up as things go on. The capitalists continue to reinvest a fixed proportion of their money profits, but that corresponds to an amount of their surplus value that's changing over time, and you can see how it's changing with this A sub p function here. This has no meaning if you have the other graphs turned on, by the way. But with that said, I think that's everything. I think I've finally gone through everything that there is to see within this Desmos app. So, you can feel free to mess around with it however you want now. I think you've seen everything that there is to see. This thing is worthless. I should delete it. Everything below here is for nerds, and you shouldn't look at it. So I think that's everything. And I think that it's great for illustrating the various controversies and ideas that are implicit to Marxist transformation and the transformation problem. When you think about the transformation problem, what you should really think about is this. The fact that this orange line is not equal to this black line here. This difference is what creates all the controversy, the distance between these two graphs. But the thing to note, the thing that I think that this app shows very clearly about the transformation problem is, yes, it is a problem that these two things aren't the same. The total surplus value somehow, some way, at the end of the transformation process becomes disconnected, or something. There's something more to it than the actual total surplus value. So even though profits are merely the distribution mechanism for the surplus product, something happens to the surplus value that disconnects it from the total profits at the end of this process. But nonetheless, there is still, as I mentioned before, a very, very close correspondence between the total surplus value and total profits. That will change as we enter and leave crises, but during the periods of calm, Marx's intuition that there has to be a very close association between the total surplus value of society and the total profits of society, that is true. That is true. They are very close together, right? There's like a 4% difference, like we said. So there's a scrambling effect, but at the end of the day, it is still nonetheless the case that surplus value is the source of profit. It's not the source of all profit. There's a tiny bit of profit, like there's 4% of the profit that comes from somewhere else, and you'd have to talk to someone smarter than me to figure out where that elsewhere is. But it's not terribly important. It's not terribly important in the sense that it should like completely disrupt that intuition that you should carry forward with you, that the profits of this society that we are in are 90% 90 to 95% surplus value being produced. Surplus product taking the form of surplus value. That's the takeaway. And even within this model, I want to emphasize that it still could be the case that surplus value is the source of all profit, and not even just 90% of it, and that there could be something implicit to the labor accounting that we're doing that we're overlooking, that is creating the problem. And that with like a more nuanced kind of labor accounting, we could actually fix the issue. That is absolutely a possibility. So is the transformation problem a real problem? Yes. Is the transformation problem overblown as a controversy? Yes, absolutely. It is way overrated. But what's interesting is that despite being overrated as a controversy, I think it's actually criminally underrated as an aspect of Marx's theory. I think that a lot of people overlook kind of all of the things that I just said over the last 2 hours. And so I'm less interested in convincing you that the transformation problem isn't actually as controversial as people make it out to be. My main goal with this video was to convince you that it's actually, a really essential piece of Marx's thinking and Marx's view of how capitalism works. So that's the main thing I hope I've shown people. So to conclude this discussion about the transformation problem, I want to bring in the incompleteness theorem, because why not? Let's do it. So in order to understand the world nowadays, what we do is we build toy models, what I like to call toy models, that make in order to make sense of the world. And these models always overlook something. We build models, they make assumptions, and then we go over those assumptions. In math, the way it's done is you write down some axioms, and then and that's an axiom system, and then you can build up a theory of implications from those axioms. In physics, you write down some laws, and then you derive dynamics from those laws theoretically. In economics, you do something similar. You make decisions. You write down assumptions about how people are going to behave, and then you look at the dynamics of how the world's going to turn out, given those assumptions. That's how it's done. But there's never ever. But you're always going to be overlooking something. You're never going to be able to write down a full list of assumptions that give you all of the intricacies of our world. That's just not how this works. That's why these are toy models. And this was shown in a ton of different ways throughout the 20th century. But the most kind of famous way probably is the incompleteness theorems. There's actually 2 of them. And then there's also a completeness theorem, which does not contradict the incompleteness theorems. If you're interested in the incompleteness theorems, I have videos on them. You should check them. But in any case, if you go through those, those are very mathematical. That's a very mathematical discussion about math and the act of doing math. But nonetheless, I think that they do have extremely valid implications for any of this kind of model building that occurs anywhere in human thought. And basically what it implies is that for any one of these toy models that you're constructing in order to make sense of the real thing, there's always going to be properties of the real thing which are ambiguous within the scope of the model. There's always going to be things about our world that you just are not quite capturing the full essence of within your model. There's always, you're building a toy. Maybe the most famous example of this in mathematics is the following. The size, if you look at the size of the counting numbers, the whole numbers, the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, that set. If you take that whole set, that's an infinite set. And so is the set of real numbers, the whole spectrum, right? Everything in between, pi and e and all that. That set of real numbers is also infinite, but it is a fundamentally larger infinity than the size of the natural numbers. And so people naturally ask the question, does there exist a size of infinity that is in between those two infinities? Now, mathematicians have all agreed at this point, more or less, to work within the same foundational axiomatic theory of set theory. That, we all accept the same axioms and work within the same axiomatic theory, or at least mostly do. And within that theory, the question of whether or not there's an infinity in between those two is unanswerable. It's ambiguous within the scope of that axiomatic theory. So you can think of the axiomatic theory here, that axiom system of set theory, as the toy model, and the real model, to the extent that there is such a thing, is like the model that all of the mathematicians found themselves working in prior to coming up with this axiom system. That's a bit of a Platonic idealist view of things, right? To frame it the way that I just framed it implies that there exists some kind of model that we were always working in, some true model of set theory, which is questionable. Does that thing actually exist? Is that a real thing? It's kind of debatable. If you think that there is one, then you're a Platonic idealist, and if you don't, then I don't know. You can go in other directions. I am trying to kill the Platonist in my head right now. That's where I am in terms of my own personal character arc. But in any case, in applying the incompleteness theorem to the real world, to the extent that you can do that, and I do believe you should, it's actually a lot more clear-cut, because there is no question of whether or not this actual true model that we were working in always is actually there. If it's absolutely there in the real world, it is the real world. Material reality is the true model, and the toy model, the axiomatic theory, is the theoretical models that we've been building, the things like the Desmos app that I made. Those are the toy models, and we're using those toy models to think about You could call it a true model, or you could just call it material reality. Take your pick. But there's no Platonic dubiousness to that, and so I think it actually becomes simpler to think about the incompleteness theorem this way, if you're framing it this way, when applying it to as a moral principle maybe to the physical sciences. What the incompleteness theorem I think implies about the physical sciences is that we construct these theoretical toy models to learn about the real world, but there's always going to be intricacies about that real world which are ambiguous within our theory. That's the incompleteness theorem. I can build a toy plane. I have to simplify something. I have to make it smaller. Something is going to be different. Otherwise, it just would be building a plane. If I build a toy model of a plane that is a perfect model of the plane, then I just built a plane. And if you're trying to build a model of the real world, a toy model of capitalism, you're going to be missing something. There's always something missing. That's what the incompleteness theorem really says. There's always some question that you could ask about the real world that is not answerable within the model that you've built, no matter what that model is. Now, that's a pretty discouraging, kind of pessimistic result. However, there's a silver lining, and the silver lining is super important. The silver lining is that, like, to return to the mathematical example, the sizes of infinity thing I was saying, whether or not there exists a size of infinity in between the size of the natural numbers and the size of the reals, that's ambiguous within the axioms of set theory that are typically accepted by mathematicians. But that doesn't mean, but what that means is that you can construct models in which it's true, and you can also construct models in which it's false. And in particular, if you construct a model in which it's ambiguous, you can always expand the model out to something which forces that thing to be true or false. You can actually, if you're given a model of set theory in which it's not the case, then you can actually expand the model out to a bigger model in which you actually do have a size of infinity in between the size of the naturals and the size of the reals. Now, the theory of doing this, the theory of taking models and like expanding them out to force specific statements to be true or false, this is called forcing theory. And it's an art form. It's some crazy stuff. Now, I am by no means an expert on forcing theory. I am merely surrounded by people that talk about it a lot. But I do know this much. Gödel's completeness theorem, not the incompleteness theorem, but the completeness theorem, has a consequence. The consequence is that if you have a statement which is ambiguous within the scope of a theory, that doesn't break the theory when you consider it to be true or false, that isn't inconsistent with the theory, then the completeness theorem gives you that you can always build a model which forces it to be true or false. That a model always exists. And so what this means is that the endeavors of these people that are doing the forcing, that are trying to expand models out to force things to be true or false, they can always be expected to succeed if they're creative enough. If they build out their model correctly, they can always do this. They can always succeed at expanding their models out in order to incorporate any new stuff, anything new that was ambiguous before. And so this forcing theory and the kind of moral conclusion of it, that you can always expand out models to incorporate new phenomena, can also be applied to the physical sciences, just like the incompleteness theorem can. The analog is expanding the models out. We have a theoretical model which has failed to account for some intricacy of capitalism. What do? We should expand it out. We should add new assumptions to the model and build it out to something which captures that phenomena. And it's a lot, and again, it's easier to do this in the real world than it is in mathematics, because presumably that question that you had is true or false in the real world. And so you don't have to have a whole debate with the entire mathematical community about whether or not you should build the model to make it true or build the model to make it false. What you have to do instead in the real world is bring in new assumptions and observations about the real world into your model until the thing shows itself to be true or false. And whether or not, that you can conclude from that the actual thing is true or false depends on the validity of those observations that you were making. So as long as you're making valid observations about the world, you can bring those valid observations into your model, expand your model out until you find the answer. And you can always find the answer. If you're applying the conclusions of the completeness theorem and forcing theory to the real world in the same way that I'm suggesting you can do with the incompleteness theorem, then you get that eventually you will always find the answer that you're looking for. But you have to keep building. The incompleteness theorem is not saying that the attempt to capture truths about our world through this process of building toy models is futile. What it's saying is that it's never complete. You have to keep building. You can never stop building and say you have the full story. That's really the moral of the incompleteness theorems. It says that you can build a toy model to make sense of the world, but you have to keep going. You can never stop. Now, to add another dimension to this, in order to build our toy models, like I said, we have to make valid observations about the real world. But any observation that we make about the real world can only be an approximately valid observation about the real world. You know, to make those kinds of assumptions can be very liberating. It can simplify toy models to the point where that allows those models to show us things about the real world that we wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. Those simplifications are essential. But this implies that you also have to be continually building other models on the side which address those simplifications, and developing those models out too. One model will never be enough. And so if you remember what I was talking about earlier with what Marx is doing in the volumes of Capital, according to what I can tell, is I mentioned that, you know, you can either think that he's continually expanding out, you know, some kind of fluid model, or he's building multiple models and expanding those out, you know, all at once. And he's doing this precisely by going out into reality and pulling back new observations, new theoretical observations that he gets from his experiences in reality and the data that he pulls from reality. I said that, you know, could be defined, to me, that's the definition of dialectical materialism, is to continually expand out models by going out into reality and pulling new things back. Now, obviously, you don't need to, you know, actually fully be aware of the incompleteness theorem and the completeness theorem and forcing theory and all of its implications to intuitively understand the value of this kind of method of inquiry. But it's kind of amazing to me that Marx is doing everything right that you would conclude from this mathematical theory. That this very deep conversation that's being had all over the place in the 20th century, that the conclusions being reached from those conversations of how things should be done are basically what Marx is doing already 100 years prior in the volumes of Capital. And to me, you know, I'm not going to pitch this as like a definition of dialectical materialism. I think there's probably a lot more specificity to it in terms of thinking in terms of like binary contradictions and dynamics emerging from that and so forth. I'm not going to say that this is dialectical materialism, but what's the conclusion here? The conclusion is that you have to continually engage in a dialectic between reality and theory. You have to continually be reaching out and bringing in observations about the real world and data from the real world and incorporating that into theory by kind of abstracting from that. And you're doing this back and forth as tensions and roadblocks and contradictions emerge between your theory and material reality as you're observing it. And so it's just kind of amazing and kind of cool to me how, you know, the broad takeaways from these theorems have you staring directly at Marx's method, you know, have you staring right at, you know, to some broad extent, you know, dialectical materialism. To bring this back around to a conversation about the transformation problem, there are groups of people that are doing both of these things. There are groups of people that are building alternative models, such as Kleiman and Farjun and Mackover. They're building alternative models based on different observations of the real world that may or may not be, you know, completely valid. They may have different degrees of validity. And they show within their models that there is no transformation problem. But just because they show that in their own models that there is no transformation problem does not mean that there is no transformation problem. Like, to the extent that the models that I've been building throughout this series are valid, there is still a transformation problem. There is still that gap between those two rates of profit. Just because you cover that up within your own set of assumptions doesn't mean that something isn't going on there. An alternative model can easily get rid of the transformation problem by just making the assumptions even more simple, right? If you make more vulgar assumptions, then eventually these kinds of intricacies, such as the transformation problem, are going to disappear. We already saw that ourselves, right? When I made those little toy reserve army models, there was no transformation problem, like I said. It's only when you make things complicated, you bring in multiple departments, that you start to see the transformation problem. And so, you know, that's going to be the real test, I think, of these alternative models from people like Kleiman and Farjun and Mackover. Like in the case of Kleiman in particular, you know, let's say that what Kleiman is doing is more in line with what Marx had in mind when he wrote Capital. Well, that's all well and good, but what I'm more interested in is, does your model actually, like, have macrodynamical implications that I couldn't have arrived at elsewhere, right? Does it say something that I didn't know already? Does it talk about something that is something besides a fall rate of profit, an increasing reserve army? Does it have anything new to say? Because if it doesn't, then I don't really care whether or not it's what Marx actually wanted to do, I care about learning about the real world. And if those simplified models are just making things vulgar and covering it up and saying, hey, see here, there's no transformation problem and everything else is fine, that doesn't mean there's no transformation problem. There's still clearly something going on there. Now, that's not to say that's what I suspect about Kleiman's model. From what I understand, I think Kleiman is actually doing something productive with his models. I think he's showing something that I think he's demonstrating a more fluid process of the transformation than kind of observing an ideal end state. I think that what he's doing can be kind of viewed more actively in the real world, and that probably has some value in itself. But in any case, that is the real test. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people like Ian Wright, who are trying to expand out the model and actually explain why the model shows us this ambiguity rather than covers it up. What Ian Wright, I think, is arguing is fascinating, and I don't really know much about it, but I think what he's arguing is that the labor accounting that we've been doing is vulgar. It's insufficient. It's insufficient to actually account for all of the socially necessary labor required by society. And in particular, I think he's arguing what we saw, which is that, whatever is causing the transformation problem, it has to do with it has to have something to do with the consumption of the capitalist class, right? When we brought consumption down to zero, the transformation problem disappeared. And so it has something to do with consumption. And so I think Ian Wright is trying to expand out the labor theory of value to a labor theory of value that is sufficient to account for all of what's going on with the labor and kind of explain that gap in between those two rates of profit. You can try to explain that gap by bringing in a more complicated labor theory of value, or you can build alternative models in which the transformation problem does not exist. Those are the two directions that we can go in, and to some extent it's good that we're doing both. But the warning to the people that are building models on the side is that if those models built on the side that cover up the transformation problem are only doing that because they're making things even simpler and they're not actually showing anything new, then that's a waste of time. Well, maybe it's a little harsh to say waste of time. What I will say is that I personally am done with the idea of pursuing knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I am done sacrificing my time to the knowledge gods. I want knowledge to work for me, not the other way around. And so whether or not these alternative models have value and are worth studying and exploring, I'd say the answer is probably yes, but I haven't looked at them closely enough to have a strong opinion there. But what I will say is that some destruction is usually necessary along with the creation. You need to build, but you also need to be willing to destroy sometimes. And I don't really think that we're quite there yet as Marxists, where there's too much bloat and we need to destroy stuff. I don't think there's much bloat yet at all. But if you're interested in kind of seeing this discussion kind of spelled out more of how we should be interpreting the pursuit of knowledge in light of these discoveries in the 20th century, I'll have a link in the description for a paper by a guy named John Boyd on the subject. But just to say kind of one last thing about what these theorems, what this discussion kind of means generally about the pursuit of knowledge. It's that I don't think that we should be thinking about building models that predict things. I don't think I've said this a lot of times already, that I don't think it's about prediction. The way I see theory is it's meant less to provide positive information, but rather to destroy negative information. The goal should be to reduce our uncertainty about the future. And the incompleteness theorem tells us that we're not going to be able to make these models predict things perfectly. The best we can hope to do is to reduce our uncertainty about the world that we're in, to better structure and understand the world we're in, and to create heuristics that allow us to kind of think through things ourselves and recognize crucial moments when they arise and give us an idea of what needs to be done and what we can be doing right now to prepare for moments and also to build the structures that need to be built. That's how I see theory. But to bring this back around to the transformation one last time, the transformation problem will always be controversial in some sense, and the reason for that is because the conclusions that Marxism comes to in general are uncomfortable to bourgeois economists, and so as long as that's the case, bourgeois economists will always find tender places in this theory to point at in order to stop thinking, because they don't want to think about this. They're looking for excuses to stop thinking about this, and the transformation problem is a place that they can do that. There's other places that they can do that, and there's other places they have done that. But because of the conclusions to this whole theory, the transformation problem will always be picked on by bourgeois economists as an excuse to stop thinking, and we should just accept that. We don't need to convince them of anything. They're not us, and we're not them. But I don't really think it should be controversial in between Marxists. I think to the extent that there is a major controversy about this among different Marxists, it's because it's over the debate of whether or not there actually is a transformation problem. And I think you probably can guess where I stand on that. It's dumb as hell to say that there isn't, and I think it's reflective. I think to say that it isn't is reflective of some insecurity that we have about our own theory, as it gets attacked by bourgeois economists. Like, I think that this is a function of some insecurity that we should work through, and I'm here to say there's no need to be insecure about this. This does not. You don't need to feel like you don't need to walk around feeling like there's this one thread that if you pull on it breaks everything that you believe in. That's not what the transformation problem is. It's a little problem. It's a little thing to deal with. That's it. There's no need to worry about it that much. And there are plenty of smart people that are working on patching it up and building around it. So the key is not the solution to the transformation problem, like in a meta way, is to stop denying that it exists and to continue to build. Just keep building. That's it. That's what we have to do. So I think that's going to do it for our discussion of the transformation problem. It turned out longer than I thought it would, but what else is new? But that is the last major topic that I wanted to cover. And so I have a few slides left in which I was going to reflect on the series as a whole and kind of come to some final conclusions about the capitalist mode of production. But that's taken on a life of its own, so I'm going to split that into its own video. And I do promise that one is less than an hour. I'm staring right at it. It's about 45 minutes right now, and I know it won't get much longer than that because I am done with it, basically, and just splitting it off because it's worth splitting off at this point. So in that final video, we're going to make our final overall reflections on the capitalist mode of production and close this thing out.